Welcome to the Hunt's Backcountry podcast. This is episode number 462, and I am really excited to share today's conversation with Ryan Jordan, the founder and owner of Backpacking Light. Backpacking Light has been a fantastic resource for more than a decade for anyone who wants to get into backpacking, through hiking, or other outdoor adventures, and take an analytical look at their gear with the goal of not just being lighter in weight, but also being better in function. And so Ryan and his crew at Backpacking Light, this isn't a hunt-focused site. They're not approaching things from the perspective of backcountry or backpack hunting, but Ryan actually is a backpack hunter himself. Steve and I have been using Backpacking Light as a resource for information and research and gear reviews for many years. And so it was a pleasure to come together with Ryan and have this conversation and learn more about Backpacking Light, the benefits of a lighter pack, the differences between general backpacking and backpack hunting, and how that influences specific gear selections. We get into certain things like headlamps and why a headlamp may be different for a general backpacker or thru hiker versus a hunter, and a whole lot more. So if you want to hear more about gear and gear philosophy, everything from high-level benefits of having a lighter pack to the nitty-gritty details on how to choose gear items, you will no doubt enjoy this conversation. Ryan has a special offer just for you guys listening to this show, so be sure to check out the link in the show description for Backpacking Light to get some free resources from him. And again, that is an exclusive offer. So thanks to Ryan and his team for making that offer to you guys, the listener. You can even hit pause and go check that out now if you'd like, and then come on back and let's get into this conversation with Ryan Jordan. Well, Ryan, excited to have you on the show today. Steve and I both have been following Backpacking Light, using the resources that you have created, the community you've created there personally. But for listeners who are maybe unaware, can you give us the 30,000 foot view on yourself and Backpacking Light?
Yeah, you bet. I've been backpacking and exploring the backcountry for my whole life since I was a kid. And Backpacking Light's been around for, I guess we're going into our 24th year now. And it has evolved into my career. I started out as a university researcher and engineer and evolved into web publishing and review writing and laboratory testing and all this other kind of stuff that evolved into what Backpacking Light is today. And so our purpose really is to help people thrive outdoors. And there's so many aspects of lightweight or ultralight backpacking that can influence a variety of outdoor activities, not the least of which is hunting. And I've been a hunter for a long time, and I've used a variety of different backcountry tools and strategies to hunt, including deer and elk and bird hunting. Everything from ultralight weapons to pack rafts to some of the fringe ultralight strategies, materials, techniques that we use today to go further with less pain out there, because hunting kind of involves carrying some extra weight that we normally wouldn't carry, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes I forget the experiences that other people have, or maybe people who are less experienced, not only in terms of time, but gear choices and lightweight. But we were just in the Grand Canyon and doing a rim to rim to rim. And some of the people we passed that were doing that, as I think a multi-day effort, and just was reminded of seeing the size of their packs and how much weight they were carrying. And it was just one of those like reminders of, I don't want to say the general public, but of people who haven't gone through the journey of understanding what being lighter on the trail can do for you. And that's, not their fault. As I said, it's a journey. But what would you say are, like, just to back up, like, what are some of the benefits? It's
we talk about ultralight or lightweight, and sometimes people just think it's, a bunch of gram weenies and ounce counters, but practically, tangibly, why go lighter?
The barriers to going ultralight, I think, have to be addressed first. And I think the primary barriers are probably this idea that going ultralight compromises either safety or comfort. And if we look at both of those things and you dive deeper into ultralight philosophy, I think you start to realize that going lighter actually makes you safer and more comfortable. And it depends a little bit on your activity in the backcountry. If you spend most of your time out there with a backpack on your back, then lightening that pack weight has a profound impact on your comfort while you're hiking. It's easier. You can go faster. You can cover more miles. You can cover the distance in less time and get to camp earlier. And the corollary to that is I think it does make you safer because it's less stress on your joints. There's less risk of becoming imbalanced in rough terrain and twisting an ankle or suffering some other injury. And the long term benefits of carrying a lighter pack for longer miles on multiple day trips are pretty significant because of the reduction in the risk of overuse injuries. So, to me, the ability to be safer, healthier, feeling better, and being more comfortable in that process are some huge benefits to ultralight. Now, I think some of the intimidation that people have comes from when they get into camp and they have minimal equipment or ultralight equipment. Are they going to be comfortable? But we've seen such a shift over the past few decades from, tiny ultralight tarps to full featured tents that now weigh 2 pounds or less, and sleeping pads that weigh a pound that provide three times the comfort of the old foamies, and warm sleeping bags filled with high fill power down, and all these really nice technical fabrics that save a ton of weight but still keep you dry in rain and comfortable in cold conditions. So, the benefits of ultralight really come down to let's reduce the strain off our musculoskeletal system and take advantage of the technology to stay warm, dry, and happy with some of the new gear that's out there.
Have you ever done or are aware of like a study that tries to compute the amount of energy? Say you did 15 miles and 5,000 feet of elevation that day. If you had a 20-pound pack or a 40-pound pack, is there any information out there that's legit that's going to give you like, I just know how I feel at the end of a long, hard day with a lighter pack. But it'd be, to have actual data to back that up, I think would be really interesting.
There's a lot of energy analysis data. So there are studies that have been done since the 1950s. They kind of started out in the US military because they were looking at this. And so what they did was hook up respirators to subjects and then put various pack weights on them on a treadmill and measured how much CO2 they were producing and oxygen they were consuming in the process of like evaluating their metabolic efficiency in response to pack weight. And so what we see there is a definite reduction in the amount of calories you consume or expend as you hike with a heavier pack. Now that's a metabolic energetics exercise, and it's important. So, you can, by going lighter, you can save calories in terms of food weight, which allows you to go even lighter. And there's some benefits there. And there's definite metabolic benefits that you feel because if you're constantly operating at a heart rate that's up near or above your aerobic threshold, you're going to deplete your blood sugar, you're going to deplete your your muscles are going to become more fatigued just through that metabolic reaction, and you end up at the end of the day feeling exhausted, and you have a more difficult time recovering the next day. So that's one side of the equation. The other side that has not been studied extensively is the impact on muscle fatigue and joint strain. So we can measure this in the lab. We can put a heavy pack on somebody and we can see what the mitochondria are doing inside of your muscles, but we can't correlate pack weight to muscle recovery yet. But we know it's there, right? We've all experienced this. What we can infer from some of this research is you put a backpack on that weighs 50 pounds and you can measure stress and strain on particular joints and joint angles and cartilage compression and whatnot. But again, quantifying that is really, really difficult because every body is so different. And you're talking about enormous quantities of data to try to create generalizations about it. But all the studies I've read point to the fact that as you increase pack weight, you are creating a fatigue response that makes it more difficult to recover and sustain that effort over long periods of time.
What do you see, Ryan, in terms of uniquenesses about generally ultralight pursuits, say backpacking? It could be through hiking, it could be a weekend, etc., versus a true backpack hunt. With you having some backcountry hunting experience yourself and you doing this, I think if you were to take the average, like pull a guy off of a through hike and say, hey, gonna need to go on a backpack hunt, I don't know that he would understand the differences, the nuances, etc. And then you can also reverse that. So, there's certain things that come to mind for me, having done both extensively. When you look at, okay, if it's a hunt, you're going to be encountering off-trail use, right? You're not just going down the trail.
Right.
You're going to need additional storage and organization for items that you wouldn't normally carry on a typical backpacking trip. You're clearly going to be carrying more weight, etc. But take that where you will. I'm just kind of curious, like if you were to say the intersection between general ultralight backpacking and then backpack hunting, there's a lot that meshes, but what are some of the discrepancies and differences to consider?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, let's look at through hiking because that represents this idealistic extreme to ultralight. So you get up early in the morning, you shove your stuff in your backpack, you grab a snack, and you're starting to walk, and you're walking most of the day. And then as it gets close to dark, you find a place to camp and you plop out and do it all again over and over and over. And so with through hiking, the pack weight issue really is it's constantly fluctuating. So every 3 to 7 days, you're popping into a town and you're resupplying, you're loading up with food. So you might start out with a base pack weight of 10 pounds, but you go into town and you're gathering 20 pounds of food for your next leg. And then you're eating that as you go. And so the pack weights through hiking really don't ever exceed anything over about 35 pounds at the high end, and this is assuming you're carrying a fairly luxurious kit. And these are practiced ultralight backpackers. These are not your normal through hikers or people who are not aware or in tune with ultralight philosophies. They can obviously carry much more weight. With backcountry hunting, you've got not only differences in gear, but differences in tempo. So you're often getting up well before dawn. And so now you've got darkness, off trail bushwhacking, and the pack weight that comes with carrying either a bow or guns and all the accessories that go with skinning game and carrying game out. So now you're talking about the addition of, at least 10, maybe 20 pounds of equipment, depending on what you're doing for optics and gear to keep you warm while you're sitting around waiting, and it's just a different kit. And the by the time you bag an animal and now you're skinning it out and carrying the meat out, now you've got real pack weight. So now you've got a system that needs to adapt not just to your 35-pound resupply pack weight that a through hiker has to deal with, but now you're carrying out, like an elk quarter or something, and you need a backpack that can support what, 70, 80, 90 pounds or more. Um, and you cannot get that with some of the ultralight technology that's out there. So there is a blend of traditional, I'm not even going to say traditional, because there are traditional backpacks that weigh 7, 8 pounds that still don't carry 70 or 80 pounds well. And so I think as a hunter, you have to look at what state of the art technologies there are to carry heavy packs, but the packs need to be as light as possible because most of the time you're not carrying out an elk quarter and you do want to minimize your pack weight. But yeah, to your point that you're hiking off trail and in the dark and slower. You're trying to be a little more stealthier. Your goal isn't to cover mileage unless you're hiking to your specific hunting destination. Your goal is to carry the pack while you're hunting, and that creates its own set of challenges.
What areas of the ultralight world, like you've been in this for decades and have seen such changes over that time. We could talk for hours about that, I'm sure. I'm curious though to like narrow down on things currently. Is I look at backpacking gear, hunting gear, uh, all really different types of technologies and improvements around recreation and gear. I see certain innovations continuing to happen, and then I see certain areas where it feels like things are stuck, things are at a stalemate.
Yeah, I would love to talk about what you think is stuck. Let's start there.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, what comes to mind, like to give context, one thing Steve and I have talked a lot about on the podcast is like bows, for example, to stick to a hunting area. Um, we've talked about how, there was big changes if you go a decade plus ago and shoot a bow that's 15 years old versus today. But if you do the same thing from like 5 to 10 years ago to today, there's much less innovation. So that's one example. It's not obviously backpacking gear related.
sure.
Um, but yeah, I guess I'm curious, like for you, do you see that happening in certain areas of backpacking gear, whether it's shelter, sleep system, apparel, etc.? I mean, some people could say that about, like pick down garments, for example. Like, yes, in the last handful of years, even longer, you have things like treated down, right? Versus old school synthetics or historically older untreated down. But it's really just this game of, down fill power, right? Like down quality, the amount of down, and then what type of shell fabric you're using. So there's so many great, like, could look at 5 different down pieces and they're all different. But at the end of the day, it's like, hey, are we going anywhere radical or revolutionary when it comes to lightweight insulation, for example?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So that'd be one. Like in contrast to that, I think there's been more innovation, more progress on, say, like active mid-layer insulation, right? Like Polartec Alpha, things like that, compared to traditional, quote unquote, old fleece. So that's been in the last handful of years, like some new excitement with different types of fleece and like active type of insulation. So those would be like examples that come to my head of maybe a stalemate on true down pieces, maybe some innovation on, these active mid-layer fleece type pieces. But yeah, I would just love to hear some examples of what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's three intersections here to explore. One is the material science side, where you're looking at the fibers and fabrics that are actually made um, and and with the goal of creating additional performance. And so we saw some step changes over the past few decades. The introduction of Cuban fiber would be one of these step changes. It's now known as Dyneema composite fabrics. But the idea here is you've created a lighter, more tear resistant fabric that is so much lighter than what was available that it immediately became quite popular in shelter construction and backpack construction. So here's a case where you have an existing material, high molecular weight polyethylene or ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, and you've created the innovation of reducing the number of fibers in the fabric construction and bonding them to a mylar or polyester film. And so that's the new part is the construction method. And so by reducing the fiber content using really light fibers and this innovative construction technique of bonding to this plastic film, you've created a fabric that is all of a sudden a lot lighter than what was available on the market at the same tear strength or waterproofing or whatever your spec, your performance spec is. So we see that we've seen that happen, but those innovations are rare. There are only so many ways to make a fabric. You either weave it or you knit it, or in the case of Dyneema composite fabrics, you hand lay it on a grid. And so there's not much you can do with respect to fabric construction. So the innovation there really came through a materials science and fabric construction evolution. Then you have the end product. Okay. So you have the tents that this fabric was made out of. And so now it spawned a new wave of tent designs that really were not new designs. They just used new fabrics, but it forced the manufacturers of the tents to create new methods of construction because Dyneema composite fabrics was not capable of maintaining strength when it was sewn in traditional methods. So there's all these bonding technologies that came out of this to make neat tents and packs. So then you've got, okay, so we've covered material science, we've covered design, now we've got use cases. So now you've got the user actually saying, okay, I've got this ultralight fabric, I've got this ultralight product. What can I do with this? And so you incorporate this into a kit and you say, okay, here's the limitations of this particular innovative design. I'm not going to take this into an alpine storm, but I can take this on a through hike and drop 2 pounds from my pack right away. So that's tents. And if you do this in all of the gear categories that we're looking at, and you find the most innovative parts of each of those gear categories, and you look at the materials, the design, and then how you use them, you can shave enormous amounts of pack weight and accomplish some really impressive feats because you are reducing your pack weight. And back to sleeping bags, like down hasn't changed, right? We haven't grown super geese yet and been able to figure out how to create 3,000 fill power down or anything like that. We've been able to find some eider down that is in the 1,000 or even 1,100 fill power range, but these are really specialty, really expensive products. And then you combine them with the ultralight nylon 7D and 10D fabrics, and you still have a sleeping bag. So to me, I agree with you. That's not a particularly innovative design solution, although it uses state-of-the-art materials to reduce weight. But let's see, when was it? About 1999, we saw the advent of quilts from Nunatak Gear specifically. They were the first people to kind of experiment with quilts. Rab had already been experimenting with what was known as a top bag, which had no insulation on the bottom, just a fabric sheet. And so now we've got kind of a shift. Here's a step change in the design of a product that saves significant amounts of weight. So now you have the same materials being put into a new design, and that is definitely going to force people to change their practices because there is some amount of skill that goes into using a down quilt versus using a down mummy sleeping bag. So to me, it's not just like changes in gear, it's the evolution of the materials that we're using, the designs that manufacturers are trying to upgrade and make innovative, and then the use cases on behalf of the user. One final example I'll leave you with is if you take fishnet mesh base layers. So Brynja is the Norwegian company that kind of has popularized mesh base layers in the United States. And these have been around for half a century, at least since the 1950s and 60s. They were very popular in European military units, and they're turning out to be very popular in American military units now for cold weather military operations. So now we've got something that has been used in a part of the world for a very long time, and it's just gaining popularity in the United States in the hunting, backpacking, snowshoeing, skiing communities here. And so now we've got there's been some innovative, I'm not even going to say innovative. There've been some marginal upgrades in materials and construction of fishnet base layers, but for the most part, these designs have not changed in 50 years. And what we're seeing is the adoption of a practice from another region into our practice here. And that has definitely created a shift in how we layer. Polartec Alpha is a great example of something that's a little bit different because now we're taking a fiber that's been around for a long time and we're just creating a new type of construction out of it that is way more breathable. And it's starting to become adopted in the backcountry communities, not because of the material technology, but because of what the manufacturer has done to incorporate it into final designs.
Let's go back to Brynja for a minute. I've been wearing fishnet long johns for at least 10 years now. Can you I rave about them. I recommend them to everybody. Very few people even try them because they think they just look ridiculous. But I know you could talk technically about what's going on there because they are freaking awesome.
I love fishnet. And so the idea here is let's put something next to your skin that has huge holes in it. And the reason for that is because when you are active and you start to warm up, you are creating humidity next to your skin, moist air vapor. And that vapor forms, I'm not going to say long before, but it's a precursor to the formation of liquid sweat. So liquid sweat forms primarily as a response to overheating at the skin surface. And that overheating comes because you are concentrating warm vapor at the skin surface. So if you can get rid of that warm vapor, you can mitigate sweating quite a bit. And so the idea with a fishnet base layer is you got these huge holes that allow you to spill that warm vapor out into outer layers so that the surface of your skin stays cooler when you are active. So that's kind of the fundamental nature of it. Now, if you layer over fishnet, there is some theory that these holes now become pockets where you can trap insulation. There's a marginal effect there, but I don't think that's the major effect of fishnet. I think the major effect of fishnet is being able to get rid of moist air away from your skin so you don't sweat as much. And if you can minimize sweating, you solve a whole bunch of downstream physiological problems, which include evaporative cooling and chilling and getting moisture into your clothing. So if you combine a fishnet with outer layers that allow you to vent that moisture out, so if you want to wear a jacket over it, that's fine, as long as your jacket has good ventilation features that you can spill that air out and exchange it with the cool air on the outside. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of fishnet, and I think that is definitely an innovative approach to layering that is completely lost on the vast majority of the general public.
Yeah, I always assumed it was the air pocket. I mean, I assumed just creating air pockets and acting like down, right? Like creating an air gap there that would keep you warm because it doesn't make sense that you put them on and you put your regular hunting pants over it and they are a very warm long john to me.
Oh yeah, no question, no question. There is an effect there, and that's to me that's like one of the biggest benefits of Polartec Alpha because now you've taken a fabric that has a ton of porosity in it, but you've also combined it with fibers that are very lofty. So you put those two things together, and you've got a really potent insulator.
I made one note when you were talking about down earlier, quilt or sleeping bag for you.
I'm a quilt guy for a couple of reasons. One, I tend to adjust my layers widely when I'm on an expedition. So I may have one night where I'm sleeping at 20 degrees and one night at 40 degrees, and I experience that quite often, especially in the fringe seasons. And so I want the ability to wear my big down puffy parka if I want to, or I want the ability to wear just base layers. And a quilt provides adjustability in its girth. So you can kind of tune the girth around you to the layering system you have to minimize the amount of air you need to keep warm inside the quilt. And that's very difficult to do with a sleeping bag. The other thing I really like about a quilt is um, it's just less confining. So on warmer nights and I want to open it up a little bit, it feels like my bed at home and I'm not having to confine myself into a mummy bag. And, there's a little bit of claustrophobic feeling there. And then the final thing is I'm a side sleeper. And that's challenging for mummy bag users because you end up breathing into your bag. And as you know, quilts are hoodless. So I often wear my down hooded jacket to bed, and the hood of my jacket turns with me and just makes it for an overall more comfortable experience.
Nice. Yeah, well, I know Mark and I have convinced probably at this point thousands of people that use quilts, but there's still some people that are holdouts. And to me, it's just such a no-brainer piece of gear. You save weight, they're more versatile, everything you just mentioned.
Yeah, for sure.
Man, so much in there. Steve and I, like, again, speaking to a hunting context, we'll talk about pack essentials. And by that, what we really mean is, hey, these are the things that take any backpack hunt, any species, any season, like you got your essential gear, which is basically like for a backpacker, it's their base, right? It's their, you need a shelter, you need some sort of sleeping pad, some sort of sleeping insulation, bag or quilt, etc. Um, if we could, Ryan, it'd be fun to go through some of those items. I know that Steve, you have kind of a list, and we'd
Hmm.
love to hear from you. We can go quick, get recommendations. We can go a little bit deeper. But we're just exploring those, again, what we call pack essentials, because that's where most of the overlap is going to be of whether you're backpacking or whether you're backpack hunting, right?
Part of this too, Ryan, we're doing a kind of a bigger content project this year, and it's really going to be doing a lot of head-to-head gear reviews before we head up to Alaska and do 3 hunts. And it's going to be, taking stoves and doing boil efficiency tests and testing in cold, testing in windy conditions, headlamps. I want to test, brightness and battery life. And so any of these that you could speak to is that you've done yourself would be awesome.
Yeah, let's start with stoves. I mean, that's an area that I think if you really want to get into the nerd culture of the ultralight community, stoves is where it's at.
Hmm.
These guys, these guys have the ability to measure boil times and efficiency on a wide variety of really novel ultralight stove systems. And so when you think of ultralight backpacking, you're mainly thinking about, those iconic items that reflect the subculture of ultralight. So the alcohol stove or the solid fuel stove or come immediately to mind. And so one of the things in the ultralight community is trying to figure out how to eke as much power and fuel efficiency out of these fairly low power systems as you can. And there's been some successes. If you look at Trail Designs and the design of the Caldera cone, they've created this pseudo heat exchanger system that makes alcohol stove systems very efficient and usable in cold, windy weather, which is obviously the nemesis of some of these ultralight systems. We focus primarily on gas stoves for a couple reasons. One, they tend to be the best option for people who are new to backpacking and don't want a high fiddle factor that requires them to go to extreme measures to use a stove in wind and inclement weather. So gas has power, and a powerful flame mitigates some of that effects. So we've done quite a bit of stove testing. We developed this protocol called Stove Bench, which evaluates the power and efficiency of a stove in a single metric in response to either large water volumes or cold temperatures or high winds. And we looked at every canister stove on the market and ran it through our stove bench protocol. And one of the things we discovered was there's some really bad stoves out there. There's some junk that
Yeah.
some of them are offered by major brands. I'm not gonna sell them out here, but there are stoves out there that are among the most popular stoves ever sold, and they scored so low. And it comes down to, and we see this a lot in gear and apparel. It comes down to creating this aesthetically pleasing stove that you can sell on a shelf with slick marketing versus creating something that truly is functional in inclement conditions. And there's definitely a difference between the two.
We did this test 10 years ago, and then that when you said junk, the MSR wind burner in really cold conditions was an example to me of one that I don't know if you experienced a similar result, but the boil times were triple some of the other ones.
Yeah, I mean you cannot take an upright canister stove that, regardless of what the manufacturer says, if they've claimed that this is a winter stove, it's probably not. There's very limited utility for canister stoves in very cold conditions, unless you're modifying it with some type of heat exchanger or you're doing an inverted kind of remote canister stove setup. So yeah, this has kind of been the MO of Backpacking Light since the inception of the company was, what are manufacturers, brands, and PR firms saying about their products and convincing their customers, why they should buy their products, but it's not really connecting to field performance. And that's always been kind of our driving recommendation. It's so easy as a media company, and I'm sure you guys experience this in the fish and hunt world, but as a media company, you get bombarded with so many messages from brands saying they have the best new product. Can you guys do a review or provide us with some press on this? And you get under the hood a little bit, and it's either the same old stuff or what they're saying is stretching the limits of truth. And we decided early on, we can go down this media model where our primary revenue comes from advertising and affiliate and helping brands promote themselves, or we can serve the consumer and help them become smarter shoppers and help them save money and buy less gear and not buy the wrong gear. And really that's been a way more satisfying way for me to have a sustainable career in this industry than just taking sponsorship dollars and ad dollars and affiliate commissions.
Yeah, that's something Mark and I've always done with this podcast is just give very candid, no BS responses to, hey, like this company makes this product and the next one they make is crap. Don't buy
Yeah,
it.
right.
And in the end, everyone benefits from that, right? Because even the companies that might be upset about the bad review are then forced to go look in the mirror and fix it. and
But
make better
some of them
products.
don't.
Yeah.
Some of them
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. And they go away.
And
That's
and
good.
there's a difference here because if you look at the cottage industry, you know, you're talking about small companies that are trying to get traction. And in some cases, if they've already got traction, they're trying to grow. And then you look at the companies that most of the companies that sell through mass market retail channels, you know, they're in a scale up phase. And so the dollars they're going to spend on innovation is going to be reallocated to market expansion and selling the products they've already developed to a wider audience. And so they're really less interested in these types of conversations. Their product development cycles are slow. They have a difficult time adapting, and it's just the nature of getting bigger. Like when your focus is on scale, your focus is on market expansion, not product innovation. And so it's really difficult to have those conversations with the larger companies. And that's probably why we I love connecting with the cottage brands because you can actually have those conversations and they're open to them still. And those conversations tend to close down as the brands get larger.
Okay, back to stoves. What give
Yes.
us three um gas stoves that you would recommend and maybe a couple pros and cons of them.
I use an MSR reactor in the winter. And the reason for this, and this offers some distinct advantages over the wind burner for cold temperatures. The main one is the amount of heat the stove transfers to the pot. A very, very efficient stove. You get very little heat loss and you end up boiling small volumes of water fast. And so then in this case, the stove never has the chance to cool down the fuel canister and slow down. So when you can allocate as much heat as possible to the pot, that makes a good winter stove. And so this is one of the few canister stoves that I recommend for winter use. Otherwise, I think you have to go to, you know, a remote canister stove with a windscreen and the ability to invert the canister so you're delivering a liquid feed of fuel. So that's my pick for winter. For most of the other seasons, I use either a Soto Windmaster or an MSR Pocket Rocket Deluxe. Both of these stoves have a little built-in windshield around the burner. It's very short, just a few millimeters, but it has a profound impact on helping the burner maintain power in light breezes. And light breezes are the nemesis of ultralight canister stoves and really destroy fuel efficiency. And in some cases, in some stove designs, a little bit of wind, you know, as little as 5 miles an hour can make your stove not even boil a liter of water. So I'm a fan of these little stoves that have large burner heads and little wind resistant lips around those burner heads, like the Soto and the Pocket Rocket Deluxe. So those are kind of my two go-to picks. I don't use much outside of those two generally, although I will for group cooking in cold conditions use an inverted remote canister stove.
Hmm. No jet boil?
Boy, I've got a lot of things to say about the jet boil, but you know, when I'm gonna say something positive first. When JetBoil launched their system, when was this? The 2000s, early 2000s, something like that. This was an innovative shift
Mhm.
in how we look at stoves. They were integrating a burner to a heat exchanger pot and attaching the systems in a way that made them very user friendly and made for exceptional boil times because the heat loss out of these systems was so low. But there was a glitch in the design, and that was the fact that the burner was open to the environment. And so if you get a little bit of wind on any jet boil design, it's going to destroy that system's efficiency. And you know, back in the old days when we were first reviewing the product and the company was young, we had these kinds of discussions with those guys, and they said, yeah, we know this is one of the things that is limiting the performance of these stoves, but you know, we've spent tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars on molding and production runs, and so we have to stick with this design and let it ride. Well, they're still letting it ride here 20 years later, and they haven't solved that wind resistance issue. But it was kind of funny. I got an email this week from their new PR agency that was announcing a new model, and I think it had a new neoprene wrapper around the cup that had some pretty mountains on it or something. And so I just kind of had to laugh. I was like, same Jetboil, different decade. And I appreciate the ease of use of the Jetboil design, but let's go back to the wind burner. You take a stove that is also an integrated system between the burner and the pot, a little bit different stove technology, but the wind burner has solved the wind resistance issue. So if you put these two stoves side by side, at least in temperate conditions, and throw a heavy wind on them, the wind burner is going to blow it out of the water every time. And so to me, that's the nemesis of the Jetboil. So here's a case where the company's scale is getting in the way of innovating and creating new, innovative, efficient products that can compete on the market. But, this is normal. This is a company that created this great initial product, grew the company very rapidly, sold it to an acquirer. Johnson Outdoors owns them now. And of course, their business model is to collect a portfolio of scalable companies. And so the goal here is market reach, not product
Yeah.
innovation.
That's happening everywhere in the hunting industry. It drives me.
Yep.
I mean, just company after company is getting bought up, and then it's like the second that happens, you flip the switch and innovation stops, and
Yeah.
the company dies slowly behind the scenes. We see, we're have industry friends all over the place, and they're it freaking sucks working for this company now. They're terrible, and the
Yeah,
public doesn't see that for quite a few more
that's
years.
right. Yeah.
It's everywhere. Interesting. Yeah, interesting on the Jetboil. That's where
Yeah.
we're Mark and I are heavy Jetboil fans. I had like four Soul TIs that I'm down to the last legs on my last one.
You should hang on to that. That's one of the few really neat products that they came out with.
Interesting. All right. Headlamps. What you got there? Give us two or three good recommendations.
Yeah, I mean in the hunting space, it's very different than the through hiking space because
Yeah.
through hikers, these are summer dwellers, and an ultralight headlamp to help you pack up as dawn is arriving is all you really need. So there's a subculture within the through hiking community that takes little keychain lights, and that's it. There's
Hmm.
another part that, might hike with a headlamp for 30 minutes in the morning and rarely at night, but they might cook dinner under a headlamp at night. And so then you're focused on task lighting, and the little tiny headlamps like the Petzl Bindi and whatnot are totally fine. With backcountry hunting or alpine climbing, I'm gonna say alpine climbing because I come from a climbing background, and that's to me is the closer corollary to
Hmm.
hunting than through hiking. You're spending a fair bit of time in the dark, and you're spending a fair bit of time navigating in the dark through difficult terrain. So I think the idea of taking a keychain light or a little tiny low lumen LED headlamp for that kind of activity is probably underpowering what you really need. And so I tend to, for alpine climbing or hunting, I tend to gravitate towards high-powered headlamps that are still small and light. And so some of my favorite ones are the Nightcore. I believe the model is NU25,
Hmm.
and they have a UL model that has shock cord as the headband instead of a full headband. So I really like those lights because they are bright and really, really efficient. I do like the shift from disposable batteries to rechargeable batteries because, over the years, as you accumulate electronics on your backcountry trips, I've got the smartphone, that's used for navigation, mild conditions. I've got an inReach for communications and emergencies. I've got my headlamp. I've got a watch that I need charged. So I'm carrying a portable battery bank anyways. And so the idea that I can charge all my devices with a portable battery bank and have a headlamp that is also rechargeable is kind of appealing to me now. And I was never one to gravitate towards rechargeable headlamps in the past, but I do appreciate their utility now.
So make sure that they can recharge while or basically be allowed to be lit up while it's charging. I just experienced this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because if you do have a headlamp die in the dark, you need to be able to use it while you're while you're giving
Yeah.
it some juice, right?
Yeah, I've used that night core extensively and I love it. I did move to a Phoenix kind of for a similar reason that just came up is the Phoenix that I'm using, you can pull the battery cell out and it has a built-in USB-C port on the battery. And so I'll carry two batteries and I can essentially charge one while using the other and be able to swap them.
Yeah, are you using the Phoenix HL50?
Yeah, the 50. I think is it
Yeah,
HR or HL? Something like that. But yeah,
HL or HR. Yeah, they all have different bulbs in them. But yeah, I have one of those as well. I love that headlamp. The aluminum housing is really nice in
yeah.
terms of quality and weather protection. And I've stepped on headlamps and broke them in the middle of the trip. And so the cheap plasticky ones make me a little bit nervous, especially on climbing or hunting trips, because you know what? You're more fatigued on those kind of trips and you do stupid stuff. And
Mhm.
so I do appreciate the durability and quality of construction that the Phoenix lights have in theirs.
And that's another, like this headlamp is probably one of those things when I was asking earlier about take a guy off of a through hike and what is he not going to understand about the the needs and consequences of certain situations like on a backpack hunt and headlamps to your point are a perfect example of guys through hiking as you said maybe it's simple task gliding but hunting could be hours upon hours off trail in the dark like Steve and I had a successful elk hunt here this past fall that we were at last light. We had been dehydrated all day. We couldn't find water. We couldn't find a campsite. Like it was hours of a very tired, heavy pack, dehydrated, exhausted condition. And you really need a light that's actually going to work in that. And it's more than just task lighting. So it's a perfect example.
Yeah,
The headlamp I was using, I was thinking of Black Diamond, and the batteries were dying. And Mark and I somehow like we had to go off this pretty steep ridge, and we chose like every decision we made was the wrong decision in the dark because the next day to go back and get the second load of meat, it was like this beautiful little path through the sagebrush up to this meadow up to the elk. And they're like, how that like packing out that night before it was freaking miserable, and the next day in the daylight we're just shaking our heads like where that's where the benefit of a really bright headlamp, at least just to kind of find your route, dim it back down,
totally agree.
would be an invaluable tool. Yeah.
I totally agree. I've spent so many times on hunting trips. I mean, I think the norm is moving in the dark, right? Because
Yeah, absolutely.
by the time it gets daylight, you know that you're on a trail and you're gonna hunker down a little bit, or you're going to move to the next spot because once it starts to get dark, you're gonna want to be at the at a good spot often away from your camp, or if you're kind of spike hunting then you're carrying your camp with you obviously. But yeah, early mornings and late nights in dark hours are the norm for this activity, and they're not the norm for through hiking.
So night core is one suggestion. Phoenix, you said you've used and like, what's you got any other recommendations there?
Yeah, I use the Nitecore NU25. I use the Phoenix HL50s, and for a really bright headlamp, and I don't use this. I use the Phoenix when I hunt or alpine climb. But if I know that I'm going to be moving fast and need a really serious headlamp for nighttime navigation, I'm going to use one of the Petzl trail running headlamps, something like the IKO Core, or a model that's stable on your head and has an external battery pack that provides more juice for longer hours.
Next one, I got sleeping pads, and yeah, a couple recommendations, and then also we've said this often. A lot of hunters don't understand R value. I was extremely glad to see them. Most companies start accepting the um, ATSM um, way to measure R value. Because for years, right, big Agnes pads, I used to hate that. Oh, it's a 15 to a 30-degree rating, and you sleep on them and just freeze your ass off all night. And a lot of guys, a lot of talk is about um, how cold your sleeping bag or quilt is rated to, right? I got a 0, I got a 15, I got a 30. And a lot of guys don't understand how important the R value of your sleeping pad is, and when, what temperatures to use, kind of what R values.
Yeah. So here's an example where we've seen an important innovation in sleeping pads over the past few decades, and it came through materials development. So we've always had inflatable pads via the Thermarest for, since what, 1980s at least, maybe even earlier. And the issue with the Thermarest that prevented it from becoming lighter had to do with the fabrics and the coatings not being able to hold air. So once the mid to late 2000s rolled around, we started to see some improvements in the coating technology and the welding technology that sealed the seams on these pads. So we made a shift from heat welding to RF welding, and we saw some advances in coatings, which allowed us to use lighter fabrics. So now we can have a 3 or 4 inch sleeping pad made out of these ultralight fabrics that is filled with some type of insulator. It can be fibers or mylar sheets that are reflective inside. And we can get R value pads that are in the 6, 7, 8 range that weigh a pound and a half. This to me is one of the more remarkable shifts in backpacking gear over the past 2 decades. Is we now have high R value sleeping pads that are actually comfortable, thick mattresses, and packed down to a very compact pack size, much smaller than the Thermarests of days gone by, right? So to me, this is one area where we definitely have seen a shift in innovation happen. Now, over the past few years, the innovations have focused on increasing R value, not necessarily in reducing the pad weight. I think we've gravitated to the idea that these pads are all going to be a pound to a pound and a half. So now how can we squeeze as much performance out of them as possible? So the two manufacturers that are kind of advancing this are Nemo and Thermarest, or Cascade Designs. And so you've got something like the Xtherm in XT, and you have the Nemo Tensor Extreme. So those are your two high R value pads. They both weigh about a pound and a half, or a little bit less, depending on the configuration of the pad. And they both capitalize on reflective barriers inside the pad that reflect radiant heat, bounce it off the pad walls so that you're not losing that radiant heat. And this results in R values in the range of about 7 to 8. So if you compare this to the old Thermarest, that the 1 inch thick Thermarest Pro model from the 1990s, that had an R value of 3. These pads are 2.5, 3 times that. And so a much more comfortable sleep, much thicker pad, and something that you have a little bit more control over in terms of inflation. So you can tune the both the R value and the comfort of the pad based on how much you inflate it. And so I like those two pad ideas. There's marketing materials are going to tell them that they're different, and the Reddit forums are going to tell you that one is better than the other, and there's definitely a Nemo camp and there's definitely a Thermarest camp, and they love to argue with each other. But at the end of the day, you're getting a very similar experience at a remarkable weight. I mean, if you think about a pad that weighs 22 or 23 ounces, that can provide an R value of 7 or 8. That's ridiculous.
At what temperature range do you recommend jumping up to that pad? Because I've got an Xterm, and yeah, like I know you take that on a July night, even if it's 45, you're going to be out of your sleeping bag the whole night.
Yeah, it does make a difference when, I mean, there's a huge difference between an R value of 3 and an R value of 8. I don't perceive the differences to be quite as dramatic between 6 and 8. I think there are other factors that go into sleeping warm than just an R value when you're at those levels. I use a Nemo Tensor Ultralight Extreme that has an R value somewhere in the 7 to 8 range. And I live in Colorado. I sleep on snow in the winter with nothing else, and it's okay. Now, sleeping on snow is a whole different ballgame because you've got conductive effects that have a far more pronounced impact on your overall sleep system R value, and you really should pair it with a thin foam pad. And so if I know that temperatures, I can get away with sleeping with a pad like that on snow in the spring or fall when, low temperatures are in the 20s and 30s, but for winter use, I still have to pair it with a foam pad. The difference is that with an inflatable pad that has an R value of 3 or 4, you really need to pair it with a fairly thick, say, 3/8 of an inch or thicker foam pad in order to sleep warm. Where these new pads from Nemo and Thermarest, I get away with a pad that's only 3 or 5 millimeters thick. So something that's like an eighth of an inch thick, like the Gossamer Gear Thin Light. So now you're talking about pairing your insulating pad, which you're using for sleep comfort and primary warmth, with a foam pad that's now just a couple of ounces, and you've got a full-on winter system for as cold as you want to go for remarkable pack weight and pack size. So yeah, that's kind of my litmus test for using these pads is, am I sleeping on snow or not? And if I am, and the temperatures are below freezing, then I just throw a really thin foam pad underneath it and it's all good.
You mentioned something when we were talking about pads that I think I caught, but it actually directly relates to a listener question we had recently. And a person wrote in and essentially asked us, does the amount that you inflate a pad greatly affect its R value? Because Steve and I have talked in the past about mistakes people make with inflatable pads is just inflating them full and assuming that's how you're supposed to sleep on them. But in all reality, we found the most comfort, and this, of course, depends on your build, your sleeping position, etc., by only using, call it 70 to 80% of the inflation of a pad. This question on does that affect R value significantly if it's only 80% inflated, I had no idea. I think you mentioned something about that in your conversation. Have you looked at that at all, or is there data on that?
Yeah, if you look at the test methods that are used to measure R value, they don't consider movement. So these pads are generally under compression and they're fully inflated, and that's how they get the R values. If you deflate the pad a little bit, and I'll be the first to admit I do deflate my pad a little bit because I find it more comfortable. I have a broken vertebrae that I did in 2005, and ever since then I've had trouble with sleep comfort. And so I find the need to deflate my pad a little bit, mainly so I can have the pad mold to my side sleeping position a little bit better. Now, if you look at compressing that pad with, let's say, a piece of plywood with a bunch of weight on it, and you deflate that pad a little bit, and then you measure the resulting thickness of the pad, the thickness is going to go down. We know that R value is somewhat correlated to that thickness. So as that thickness decreases, your R value is going to decrease proportionally. So if you deflate your pad by 80% or by 20%, then you could expect a 20% decrease in R value. That's one side of the equation. And this is the side of the equation that, people who develop test protocols in the lab love to say, here's how it's going to perform in the field. But the reality is not quite like that, because you're dynamic and you're mobile and you're moving around when you sleep. And that movement creates convective currents inside the sleeping pad, and those convective currents might push warm air out towards the edges, and you're going to lose heat out the edges of the pad, or the parts of the pad where your body's not covering it, or your sleeping bag's not covering it. And so you get this disproportionate loss of heat throughout the pad as you move. So as you deflate the pad, there's more air movement that goes through the pad as you move around at night. And so what you end up losing is probably a little bit more than 20%. If you deflate your pad 20%, you're probably losing 20% of the R value from the thickness of the pad, but you're probably losing marginally a little bit more just as a result of increased air movement in this somewhat deflated pad. This is why I think it's really important to investigate pads that have really high R values, because those R values of 7 or 8, you can deflate them and still get an R value of, let's say, 5 or 6 in the worst case scenario. And that's still way better than a whole bunch of pads on the market for marginally more weight. And so I think if we can educate consumers to gravitate towards these pads that have high R values, it will give them versatility and flexibility in what they can do with them.
But one thing that came to mind very early in the conversation was, um, being comfortable out there with ultralight gear, and that you really can be like I'm a ultralight backpacker, and I always challenge. They're like, "Oh, I can't get my pack as light as yours." And I'm like, "Well, tell me what I'm missing, right? Like, tell me I am as comfortable as anybody else out there. I'm not missing anything. It's just people are afraid of slight discomfort. We had Andrew Skirka on a long time ago, and he used the term of packing your fears. And I think there's just so much truth to that. So maybe just speak on some of that for a minute.
That is a great point. People are, and it's gotten worse over the years, I think. And I don't know. My grandfather said the same thing. So maybe it's just as we age, we look at the young people and say, "Oh, they don't have the grit that we did when we were young." So maybe it's just the cycle's repeating itself. But I do think that there is an intolerance for discomfort that is a huge barrier for people to get through. And it doesn't matter if it's like cold or mosquitoes or darkness or the fear of bears or whatever, but there are so many opportunities to be uncomfortable in the backcountry. And I there just packing gear to address all those eventualities is a great way to be uncomfortable. And so if you want true discomfort, man, pack a 50-pound pack around, and then come talk to me about it. I will take slight discomforts in the backcountry from, being annoyed about having to deal with an alcohol stove versus something that's heavier, that's easier to use, or dealing with having to be out in mosquito country in a head net versus enclosed in a full tent. Those kinds of things you can get practiced at. And I think you have to expose yourself to those discomforts and then find the ones that are non-negotiable for you and use gear to solve those problems, because those are the ones that give you the highest rate of return. But there are so many opportunities to be uncomfortable in the backcountry that I think you have to decide which ones are okay with you and that you can manage without high levels of anxiety.
Opportunities for discomfort. I like it. To conclude, one, thank you for your time, and we would absolutely love to have you back again if you're ever able. But to wrap up and talk more about backpacking light, I know you're going to have a link that we can share. We're going to put that in the show description. Um, But explain what Backpacking Light is, and you talked about like the membership model, things like that. So in terms of understanding more resources, accessing all the content, the testing, everything that you guys have to offer, can you give us a rundown of what that would look like for listeners?
Yeah, we are primarily at heart a membership community of users. And so we have three kind of main initiatives. One is community. We have online forums and opportunities for our community to exchange information about gear and trips and everything else. We've I don't know, something like 1 million forum posts in our forums through the years, and it's an active community that gains a lot of value from each other. So that's kind of the foundation. We have an article library of about 2,500 articles that tackle everything from gear and skills and places and people and technology and testing. And then we have an education side where we provide online video education across a variety of topics. And so different levels of membership can access different parts of those resources. And we have a number of different revenue streams. We have some of the traditional revenue streams like affiliate and advertising, but membership constitutes 70% of our revenue. And it's always been the core part of our revenue since about 2003, I think, is when we went to a subscription model. And it's just so cool to have sustained the company that long because of people who have supported us with their membership fees. And to me, that helps me thrive as a business owner and know that we're serving the user community and not just being a voice for the brands that are out there.
That's great. Well, again, thank you so much for the time, sharing all of it with us today. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it as well. I'd love to be back on sometime. I think we have a lot more to talk about with respect to gear.
Well, what a great conversation. Don't forget that there's free resources from Ryan and his team if you go to backpackinglight.com/hunt. Again, this is a free resource he put together just for our listeners. There's also a link in the show description. If you have any questions or follow-ups, whether it's directly from this episode or just general questions for the future, be sure to reach out and let us know. As you heard, we'd love to have Ryan back on the show again in the future so we can answer some of those questions with him, or perhaps there's other questions that Steve and I can answer directly on one of our future Monday Minute episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, just send an email to podcast@exomountaingear.com. Also, if you are enjoying the show, it would help us tremendously if you can just leave a rating or review in whatever podcast app that you use. Because we don't do any advertising or have sponsors or anything like that, your support is how this show grows and continues to be supported and published by us. So thank you. And finally, if you haven't yet subscribed, just be sure to hit follow or subscribe in your podcast app so that you receive future episodes automatically, and we'll talk to you soon.